So our next speaker is Baron Adonis, who I'll just introduce for a moment and then hand over to him. He's a journalist, come academic, come politician, so the FT and the Observer, the Institute of Government, I think started in Oxford City Council, am I right, Andrew? Before becoming policy advisor and head of policy under the Blair government, Minister of State for Education, Minister of State for Transport, and latterly Secretary of State for Transport. So this is someone who's been at the sharp end of policy formulation in some contentious parts of government. Not sure there are any non-contentious parts of government actually, but certainly some that are very relevant to our world. And of course now in opposition, a key component of the opposition forming its plans for what it would do were it to get its hands back on the levers of power. I also read that you'd written a piece on the Victorian House of Lords. I assume that's a historic piece, but okay. Anyway, I'll hand over to Andrew Adonis, and I think you'll be happy to take some questions when you've finished talking to Andrew. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Adrian. I say the Victorian House Lords was history. It hasn't changed much since, actually. This is still pretty much recognisable from there. When I was Secretary of State for Transport, for reasons that I can't begin to fathom, they called me the thin controller. But we're deep in opposition at the moment. And as I was listening to Adrian saying people are taking Labour seriously, I need to give you a word of caution. We're still 2 years out from an election. It's a long period. There's a fixed-term parliament, which is one of the big reforms that the coalition brought in. So unless the Liberals decide to commit suicide, which is always possible, if the pressure gets really intense, that the pressure's just become unstoppable. But by and large, people don't in politics, as in life, commit suicide. So assuming that they don't do that, this Parliament will run its course. It will go through to May 2015. The Lib Dems have got nowhere else to go at all. Clegg personally has absolutely nowhere else to go at all since he's thrown in his lot with David Cameron. So we are still essentially in mid-term. We're at, I suppose, what Churchill would have called at the end of the beginning, but we're not yet at the beginning of the end. And a lot will happen over the course of the next 2 years in politics. It's very, very hard to predict. And just to give you a few salient facts, in the last 80 years, there has only been one government, only one in the last 80 years that has not got re-elected at least once. The natural course of politics is that governments get elected for more than one term. However, that one case of a government that only got re-elected, so that didn't get re-elected at all, was the 1970 Heath government. And there are some things in common between this government and that. A really deep economic crisis, which is enduring, a real sense that the government hasn't really got a grip on it, and even though the figures for growth last week were better than people had expected, the fact that we were debating a possible triple-dip recession is a sign of how desperately bad things are. Unemployment is endemic and rising. There's a big squeeze on living standards. However, I think those of us who lived through the 70s wouldn't recognise the 73-4, the complete collapse of civil order and an international crisis that was steadily deepening, even from the situation it had been before in the situation at the moment. So my own view is that the jury is very much out. I mean, I very much hope my lot come in. I desperately hope that we are able to take over from the current lot, who I don't think have done a particularly good job. But as I say, the natural instinct is for governments to get re-elected. If they're not, it's because there's a really serious crisis going and they're not seen to have had a grip on it. They clearly haven't got a grip on it. Whether the thing is sufficiently bad for the electorate to want to change the government is going to be the job of the next 2 years. There is one big structural advantage that we have at the moment, which is the electoral system, which is unbelievably weighted in Labour's favour. The party which formed a government since 1924 with the lowest percentage of the vote wasn't in fact David Cameron in 2010, it was Tony Blair in 2005. 35% majority of 66, landslide majority by historic standards, though it looked small because it was his third re-election and it was down on the majority before. In 2010, David Cameron polled 36% of the vote, 1% more, and was minus 20. That is the way that the current electoral system works at the moment. And the thing I find most inexplicable, I mean, I'm sort of long in the tooth in politics, so I normally understand these things. The thing I find most inexplicable about the politics of the last 3 years is that David Cameron didn't do whatever it took to get Nick Clegg to vote for those boundary changes, because they could well be the difference between him winning and losing the next election. And don't let people say that the result of the election will be illegitimate because somehow a party which had a very small percentage of the vote has its hands on the levers of power. Once the seats are declared, that is the reality. The government depends upon the seats that there are in the House of Commons, and on the calculations which are most reliable that I've seen, if the Labour Party gets 1% more of the vote than the Conservatives, it has an overall majority. 2 and 3% win to a big majority. The Conservatives need 7% lead over Labour to get a majority. And I would be astonished in the politics, I mean, I was a former Lib Dem myself, so I know it, if there is the potential for Labour and the Lib Dems to form a majority together. I think it's highly likely that they would do so. Indeed, I think that would have happened at the last election if there had been a Lib-Lab majority, because the Lib Dems, on many of these public service issues we've been referring to, are actually to the left of Labour. You know, when I was there in the Blair government seeking to produce more choice, contestability, diversity in public services in order to meet the clear demands of the voters and the consumers, the Lib Dems opposed a lot. In education, they're the political wing of the National Union of Teachers. In health, they're the political wing of the BMA, and though that's been somewhat blunted by the fact that oddly they're in coalition with the Conservatives, so you've got the party of the far left, which is what the Lib Dems are on these issues, in with the party of the right, which is what's causing so much difficulty and tension at the moment. If there had been the capacity to have a Lib-Lab majority, last time I think they would have been forced to go for it, even though Clegg himself is a figure of the centre-right. And if there is a Lib-Lab majority after the next election, I'm sure that's what will happen. So that's the first big set of parameters that I think the political game is very open, but it's still 2 years away and a lot can happen in 2 years. In terms of the big economic imperatives, the big economic imperative is acute crisis. This is the situation that we're in at the moment. Acute crisis. We're still in GDP terms 3% below pre-crash levels in 2008. In terms of what that means, the projections were we'd be about 15 to 20% above 2008 levels by now in terms of the mainstream economic forecast in 2008. Well, that is the equivalent. If we had performed according to trend, we would now have GDP about £300 billion larger than it is at the moment. So when you set aside the £300 billion larger, which people were projecting in 2008, against the contest that there is between the parties, which is whether, you know, we've got a deficit of 120 billion this year, it was 160 billion in 2010, we were essentially debating over a 4-year period a fiscal contraction, give or take 40 billion. We were 40 billion slower than the Conservatives. It was the position then. That was the difference between what was called the Darling Plan and the Osborne Plan. I suspect that given the scale of difference between the parties, we could be in a similar position at the next election. That, of course, is tiny compared to the overall fiscal pressures and the big problem we've got of growth. And that leads on to my third point, which is the parameters that we're in mean that for Labour coming in, what we need above all is good value out of public spending, because what we want to do, of course, is to preserve the maximum level of service that we possibly can, and ensuring that we can get value, and listening to the presentations earlier, where value can be secured to maintain services. This is going to be a critical imperative for us. And the key test, you know, when I worked for Tony Blair, our mantra is what matters is what works. That doesn't mean to say we were value-free. What we actually wanted was steadily better and more citizen-responsive public services, and that is what we continue to want, because we're the party of the community and wanting to see strong public services. But seeing that we get the best possible value we can for public spending when it is severely constrained, and where even if we were to take a more expansionary position in terms of the fiscal position at large, we're still going to have to deliver, essentially, given inflationary and user pressures, more for less, is going to be an acute challenge. And the position that we inherit in 2012, the judgments that we will take sector by sector on balance between public and private and all that will be driven above all by value. But let me talk about a few other more specific pressures to give a bit more fine grain to this. Infrastructure first. There are big demographic pressures that are going to lead to demands for more infrastructure. The most striking document I've read recently in terms of the likely pressures that there are is the London plan, Boris's plan for the next 20 years. London's population is projected to grow to 10 million by the early 2030s, another 1 million more than now. It's already at the same level as it was at its peak before the Second World War. There's huge demographic pressure in London and the South East, and that will have a big demand for new infrastructure. I've just finished chairing for London First, the London Business Group, a review looking at the case for a second Crossrail line. The existing tube and public transport system in London will completely seize up by the mid-2020s, despite the 1/3 increase in the tube capacity that's being put in at the moment, the 10% total increase in capacity being put in by the East-West Crossrail line. I'm actually seeing Boris this afternoon to discuss it. A public consultation is about to start on the route for the Crossrail line, the second Crossrail line going from the southwest to the northeast. And though there'll be a huge amount of argy-bargy on how it's going to be funded and whether is there going to be new business contributions and all that, London simply will not be able to cope without significant additional infrastructure by the late 2020s. That's transport infrastructure, that's going to be housing infrastructure. I'm also later on this week meeting with HESA to discuss what we do with the Thames Gateway, which I think is a potentially huge growth area for housing and hasn't been cracked in the last 20 years, needs the same kind of treatment that we've had for Docklands, which has been so successful. It's also going to mean significant other public service infrastructure, notably schools. There's a massive shortage of school places in London at the moment. The incoming government in 2010 largely axed the school building programme. Mention was made earlier of the priority schools programme for building. In large parts of the southeast, it doesn't matter who's in office, we're going to have to build more schools because there simply aren't enough schools to provide the places at the moment. So on infrastructure, though when public spending is cut, infrastructure always takes a bigger hit. It's taken a much bigger hit than revenue spending since 2010. It's been cut by twice as much. There is a strong sense that it's been cut too much. A real debate taking place between the parties now about who can get infrastructure moving most, not least because of the jobs implications of it, and because of the demographic pressures. Some increase in infrastructure spending, particularly in London and the South East, is simply going to be unavoidable to meet basic pressures. When it comes to public services, you asked me for my view, and my view is more complicated than the one that was set out earlier, and I need to explain why. The view that my side holds very strongly is what matters is what works. However, when it comes to frontline education and health services, that doesn't completely apply. There is a really strong stigma that applies to the phrase privatisation, and a determination to differentiate between what are essentially support services and what are essentially frontline services. Now, simply listening to the discussion, it's not always easy to determine what is the division between those two. But every time you seek to put to the private sector what has been a state-provided frontline service in the past, there's normally huge controversy if it becomes a point of principle, and it becomes a point of principle if you get a big debate amongst the public service providers themselves about whether those services should go into the private sector. Let me take various sectors in turn on this. In terms of criminal justice and employment, there are fewer points of principle. Private prisons now go back more than 20 years. The principle of having privately provided criminal justice services in almost all parts of the criminal justice system is not contested. Indeed, oddly, the present government has been rowing back on the contracting out of the prison service because of its concern over value for money. But there aren't points of principle here. There's more of a debate in the welfare area, but the reason there's more of a debate in the welfare area is it's not clear that the work programme has been working. So here, the test, because my lot had been seeking to bring in more private providers of jobs-related services before the election, because what we're desperately keen to do is to have a much better, more fit-for-purpose, client-friendly service for getting people back into work. But the record of the work programme hasn't been good so far, and on the test of what matters is what works, it's not clear that new patterns of provision there have been working so far. And so that, I think, is going to remain quite strongly contested, but not as a point of principle about the engagement of the private sector, simply whether value is being delivered. When it comes to education, I don't believe this government, and certainly not a Labour government, would allow schools in terms of their overall budgets and budgets for teaching and learning to be put out to for-profit companies. The present coalition hasn't done that. We almost certainly wouldn't do it. There's no, unlike the position in the health area where there are EU procurement rules in play, they don't apply in the case of publicly provided education. And because there's such a large not-for-profit sector in education, I spent a good part of my time in government pioneering new types of independently managed schools called academies. And this was hugely controversial, particularly in my own party at the time, because schools had been almost entirely provided, apart from the churches, by local authorities before. We introduced a new type of school called the academy, which is now becoming the standard type of school. Academies are not-for-profit independent trusts, which is revolutionary in terms of the management of schools, including private schools, universities, education foundations, individual philanthropists, existing successful state schools setting themselves up as not-for-profit trusts and now running chains of schools. So there's been a revolution in terms of the way education is delivered. We now have large numbers of chains of schools of more than 30. There were no chains of schools at all before the academies came in. And there's a big diversity of suppliers who are taking root. And under the present coalition government, most secondary schools and an increasing minority of primary schools will become academies. That means they're independently governed, many of them in chains run by the sorts of groups I've been mentioned. However, not one of those groups is a for-profit organisation, and nor is it likely to be in the foreseeable future. And there's a very good reason for it. On the test, what matters is what works. There isn't yet, I mean, there are very few successful profit-making school companies internationally, but there's none that has yet managed to demonstrate greater value for money or management and results success than the best not-for-profit trusts. And England, for historical reasons, has a very, very large not-for-profit sector in education. All of our private schools are charities. They're all not-for-profit trusts for deep historical reasons. Many of them have integral links with the churches and are quasi-religious foundations, and that status is not likely to change. The churches are very large providers of education, of course. They're by definition not-for-profit. Our universities are not-for-profit. All of our existing state schools, of course, are not-for-profit, and we have a very large array of independent not-for-profit foundations, many of them going back centuries as historic entities which are engaged too. So I think it's very unlikely that it's certainly a Labour government wouldn't, and I wouldn't support it myself actually, because I think that the big task in education in terms of producing diversity is leveraging the successful not-for-profit sector much more effectively in delivering state education, particularly universities, private schools and successful state schools. I keep banging on all the time about seeking to partner existing successful private school trusts with state schools to get them to manage public-private entities. But the word private is not for profit very much in this sector. The provision of services to schools, though, is very different. As I say, there will be a demand for additional school places. That's going to be very significant. PF2 is a somewhat improved version of PFI, but the characteristics are still essentially the same. Because there's going to be a big demand for new capital stock, variants of PFI are going to be absolutely essential so that the whole cost isn't borne up front, and to get much better value in terms of the provision and maintenance of facilities over the medium term. There's been a lot of controversy in the education sector about the operation of PFI, but it's essentially the operation, not the principle, in particular the flexibility with which facilities are provided, which has been a big issue in education. But now that the big review has taken place, PF2 is there will be a demand for additional school places. In terms of the provision of new schools and school services, support services, this I would see as a growing area. When it comes to health, the situation is very complicated. On the one hand, there are the EU procurement rules which provide for competition. They've been in place for some time. They're not new. They go back now more than a decade in terms of their practical operation. There's also, it's absolutely right to say there's a greater emphasis already on contracting out in non-acute services, and to be blunt, the closer these services are to the community and to the local authority sector, where adult social care has been substantially community and private sector provided for a good while now, the more contestable these markets are and the greater willingness there is to see private sector engagement in them. When it comes to acute services, though, the situation is not at all clear-cut. there is massive opposition within the NHS itself to the contracting out of these services. If you want to understand how intense this debate is, read the debate in the House of Lords last week on the regulations on implementing Section 75 of the Health and Social Care Act. And I'm not a health expert myself, I do education, but simply trying to make sense of it, you have got very, very strong competing pressures here. You've got EU regulations which require there to be contestable markets. You've got clinical commissioning groups, though, which of course are dominated by the GPs, who are largely in hock to the existing acute service providers, who are none too keen to see competition in these areas. You've got the acute hospitals themselves, of course, whose income crucially depends upon these contracts from the clinical commissioning groups, who are even less keen on seeing competition in this area. And the actual operation of competition is very complicated. On the one side, there is a requirement to have contestable markets. On the other side, the minister in the House of Lords last week was giving all kinds, and this is a coalition minister, my lot will be even less keen on seeing contracting out as a matter of principle, was giving all kinds of assurances about how, in fact, the clinical commissioning groups can package, they can package services as they see fit. They can make judgments as to whether there is, in fact, only one competent provider of those services, and of course, the one competent provider is almost always going to be the existing NHS provider. It's entirely up to them how they package these services, and all the array of services which we saw described, how they package those acute services up. Entirely up to them how they do it. It is then their judgment as to, not Monitor's judgment, their judgment as to whether or not there is only one competent provider of those services. And that looks to me therefore to put huge discretion in the hands of the clinical commissioning groups as to what they in fact do. And they will come under massive pressure. As I say, just read the House of Lords debate last week. They will come under massive pressure from the existing NHS providers not to put these services out to tender. Because the financial position of the trusts is very difficult at the moment for all the reasons that we had described earlier, though health spending is rising marginally in real terms, health inflation is, of course, more than outpacing health spending, and user demands are greater still. Because of the massive pressure that you've got on the acute hospitals, the same pressure that, of course, is leading them to be very radical when it comes to support services, because they need to get the maximum value they can out of those, including rationalising their estates. They're rationalising their estates short of actually closing anything that is publicly controversial. That's a very difficult job. Just look at what's going on in South London at the moment. It's a very difficult task to perform. And when it comes to support services, again, I think they'll be very keen to get the maximum possible value they can. When it comes to the acute services, the paediatrics, the haematology, all those ones that we saw on the list earlier, where there's very little contracting out at the moment, there will be a huge political controversy, I can assure you, about increasing that rate. Now, you can paint two scenarios as to what will happen. Because there is the requirement to tender, there is massive financial pressure and demand, which is going to be facing the clinical commissioning groups all the time. And because there is rightly great pressure to get many of these services out into the community, because that's where the users actually want them, and bed blocking is as big a problem now as it was a decade ago, seeking to see that it's possible to get more services in the community, and the more community-related these services are, as I say, the less the existing NHS providers control existing provision. You could see a steady increase in the contracted out proportion of these services. That's one scenario. The other scenario is that, in fact, the acute hospitals at the moment, for whom their whole livelihood depends upon maintaining their current share of the market, with massive financial pressures facing them, and with the GPs, who of course control these clinical commissioning groups, regarding themselves as basically part of the same family as them, see that the brakes are put on an expansion of private sector provision, with Monitor, which is of course, as always with regulators in this area, having to play quite a political game here, not wanting to intervene more than it thinks is going to be politically acceptable. Now, as I stand back and look at this, it's clear to me that there will, over time, be more contestable markets. It's clear where the trend is. It's clear that there will need to be much better and more intensive community-provided services. It's clear to me that the closer you get to the community, because community services have always had a much greater independent input to them, because they're not, of course, directly run by the general hospitals, which is where the trusts reign supreme, the greater the opportunity is going to be for new and independent providers. But the pace at which this happens, particularly with services which are currently provided by the acute trusts, the pace at which that happens, I think, is hard to predict at the moment. And therefore, if I'm giving you my view as to how this will go, I think it depends very much on the value for money you can offer, how you can package services in a way that can offer significant savings to the trust and reduce the element of controversy that comes with what will be seen by opponents as privatisation. And in terms of the Labour Party, our concern, and it will be a continuing point of difference with the coalition, is fragmentation of services and privatisation as an objective in its own right, rather than the delivery of value for the consumer and maintaining the integrity of the existing NHS. So how do you put all that together? With the exception of some areas where, as I say, there's acute political controversy, the critical issue is what matters, is what works. We're all in essentially the same game when it comes to in terms of the imperative to achieve much greater value for money because of the huge fiscal pressures. I believe that there will be a demand for more infrastructure spending, not least because of the massive demographic pressures that we face in London and the South East. That I think is going to become steadily more acute because of the capital famine that there's been over the last 3 years. So it's not so much the differences between parties, it's the overall fiscal and economic climate that I think is the big driver of reform in this area. But at the margins, particularly when it comes to the privatisation of what are seen to be clinical services in the NHS and frontline education services, I don't want to disguise from you the fact that that my party wouldn't want to be at the cutting edge of privatising services where there is no clear value for money argument that can be made, and in the case of acute and frontline education services, maintaining the integrity of existing public service providers would still remain an important priority for us.